morning. I think most of you already know Jim, but I'm going to read this bio for him, and for those of you who haven't been here before or heard him speak. Jim was born in the Bronx, New York in 1931. He holds a Bachelor of Arts from Iona College and a PhD from NYU. He taught history for more than 40 years. The last 30 of them were at the University of Akron in Ohio. Pardon me? Okay, sorry. He and his late wife, Marie, moved to Arizona in 2005 to be close to 2 of their 5 children after Marie's diagnosis of Alzheimer's. The other children live in Brooklyn, New York, Pittsburgh, and rural Washington State. Marie died in 2014. Jim, a self-confessed secular humanist/social democrat, has devoted his old age to helping launch his grandchildren and to reading the great books with what he said he hopes is intelligent appreciation. I think that those of us who have already heard him speak appreciate both his intelligence and the way in which he shares the knowledge gleaned from those great books. So everyone, please help me welcome our fellow HSGP member, Jim Richardson.
Thank you. Yes, I first spoke to this group 10 years ago, and I've loved every opportunity that I've had to address this group. Best audience I've ever had. No doubt. In the current United States, there are different basic beliefs, what John Rawls calls comprehensive accounts, underlying the commitment to widely shared political principles: human rights, equality, the rule of law, and democracy. Among these basic positions are first, religion, that consider humans as creatures made in the image of a transcendent God. Believers can rely on an authoritative book, such as the Bible or the Quran, or the teachings of a church as guides to the good life. That does not set for us. Second are the various forms of utilitarianism, which hold that humans must seek to maximize joy and minimize suffering among beings which can experience these states. The third, beyond religion and utilitarianism, are philosophies inspired by Immanuel Kant, the great German 18th century philosopher who held that the right must take precedence over the good. That position is known as deontology. And to the most extreme Kantians, do the right thing even if it leads to negative consequences. He gives an absurd example of somebody running around with an axe in his hand looking for a neighbor, and you're not supposed to lie to him about where the neighbor might be. It's strange belief. Utilitarians and Kantians often hold that a belief in God is not necessary to live a moral life. Today, I want to look at 3 important thinkers who exemplify these positions, all of whom were born in 1931, the same year I was, which may be one of the reasons why I found them interesting. More than that, but it's just an interesting coincidence. For religion, our case study is the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor. For utilitarianism, it is the American Richard Rorty, and for a Kantian view that the right takes precedence over the good, it is the American Ronald Dworkin. Charles Taylor, a practicing Roman Catholic, is the only one of the 3 who is still with us. Taylor is a native of Quebec province who embodies diversity. His father was a Protestant Anglo-Canadian and his mother a Catholic French-Canadian. And he grew up natively fluent in both languages and in both cultures. He majored in history at McGill in Montreal and holds a doctorate in philosophy from Oxford, where he worked with such luminaries as Stuart, Hampshire, and Isaiah Berlin. Among his many books are Sources of the Self, The Making of the Modern Identity, that's the subtitle of Sources of the Self, The Language Animal, and A Secular Age. He's written a lot of other books, but those are 3 that I'd like to focus on. Taylor is not the sort of Catholic who decries all deviations from Thomism, St. Thomas Aquinas' Christianization of Aristotle. My undergraduate college, Iona, was a Catholic college where philosophy was mandatory, but what it was a memorization of previously prepared positions, Thomas Aquinas' version of Aristotle, rather than discussion of important ideas and concerns. The one exception was a history of philosophy course from which I derived a great deal. Let's see now, where am I? This is what really drives me crazy here. I don't have the ability just to keep everything in my head at the same time. Sorry about that. Okay, one of the things about Taylor, he does not believe there should be any restrictions on abortion during the first trimester of pregnancy. So therefore that differentiates him from many of the more orthodox Catholics who believe that somehow when the sperm and the egg get together you have a fully developed human being. You may have a potential, but not fully. Ideally, he puts, here I am. What Taylor dislikes about modern culture is its disenchantment, its rejection of transcendent being. He recognizes the achievements of modern science, but he does not celebrate them. He often puts science in scare quotes, as if natural science makes its advances by setting aside aspects of human life that really count, such as what do we want to be and to love. Ideally, we should love God and think about an afterlife. That's Taylor. To Taylor, belief in a personal God, if not necessary to be human, is a distinct plus in being a more complete one. Let's move on now to the spokesman for utilitarianism, Richard Rorty. He specifically rejected this desire for enchantment. Rorty never questioned his childhood atheism, but he had no quarrel with anyone whose pursuit of happiness included membership in a church. Where he drew the line was any attempt on the part of churches, their leaders or their members, to influence public policy on the basis of religion or impose their beliefs on others. He considered himself more anti-clerical than anti-religious. And I would say, this is me speaking, at their best, churches do provide members with a sense of community, reduce loneliness and alienation, and create opportunities for growth and sharing. But useful fictions are still fictions, and reliance upon such fictions is ultimately limiting. I understand the rationale and the appeal of being free from religion. At the same time, that sense of freedom brings a requirement to figure things out for ourselves. If there is no authoritative book or institution, how do we answer the big questions? One of Richard Rorty's ways of dealing with the big questions was to set them aside. He said we don't solve the perennial problems, we just get over them, we just set them aside. Do we need a religion or a fully fleshed out philosophy to promote human flourishing and reduce human suffering? Not really, said Rorty. Get the politics right and the philosophy may take care of itself or be left to personal choice. Such a stance did not sit well with many other philosophers. They thought he was trashing their discipline. Rorty was the only child of James Rorty, a poet and critic of Irish ancestry, and Winifred Rauschenbusch, daughter of Walter Rauschenbusch, one of the major proponents of the social gospel movement in American Protestantism. Walter Rauschenbusch was interested in Christianizing the social order, taking the principles of Christianity and applying them to this world, not just the next. I should mention that Winifred spelled her name differently than her father did. Rauschen was spelled with a C. Bush was spelled with a C. She took the two C's out, so her Rauschenbusch does not have a C in it. Richard's parents were dedicated Trotskyites during his childhood. Trotskyite was a generic term for people who were Marxist in orientation but did not care for Stalin's Soviet Union. Sidney Hook, one of John Dewey's favorite students and a noted anti-Stalinist Marxist, was a close family friend. As a 7-year-old, Richard passed out party goodies to Hook and critic Lionel Trilling. So he was introduced at a very early age to the very heavy hitters in New York intellectual life in the 1930s. A self-described snotty, nerdy kid, young Richard suffered from schoolyard bullying. At 15, he was sent off to the Hutchins College of the University of Chicago, described by A.J. Liebling as the biggest collection of juvenile neurotics since the Children's Crusade. Rorty majored in philosophy at Chicago, stayed on for a master's degree, and then went to Yale for a PhD. He finished his doctorate at such a young age that he was eligible for the draft and spent 2 years as an enlisted man in the peacetime army between Korea and Vietnam. One of his students thinks that his army exposure was an important part of his political development. I'm inclined to agree. I know that the Army was an important part of my education in making me aware of America's diversity. I was the I&E specialist for the company, which meant I had access to everybody's test scores. We had about the same number of college graduates in the company as we did with people who could not be rated at a fourth grade level of education. So we went from one extreme to the other. After the Army, he taught philosophy at Wellesley and Princeton, publishing enough quality papers to be granted tenure at Princeton, and not an easy thing to do. His book, Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, was a philosophic blockbuster published in 1979. I'm going to forego discussion of that book on the basis of my ignorance. I've read it twice, but I still wouldn't want to recite on it, and focus on what Rorty had to say about American politics. Among his philosophic achievements was reviving interest in American pragmatism, the philosophy of Charles Peirce, William James, and John Dewey. By the way, we have 2 volumes of William James in the Library of America set that we have back in the library there. Dewey was a particular favorite. Like Dewey, Rorty became a major public intellectual, accepting positions at the University of Virginia and later Stanford that let him pursue and teach whatever interested him. Pragmatists focus on the future rather than the past. How do we do better? Rorty made more of the distinction between public and private than Dewey did. Dewey seemingly wanted constant democratic group discussion to set goals and promote growth. A constant town meeting would be sort of Dewey's idea of the way we should live. Rorty sought private space where all could pursue happiness in their own way, so long as they did not interfere with others' pursuits of happiness. Even so, Rorty seemed more interested in reducing misery, which requires concerted public action, than in promoting happiness. He put reduction of misery even first. The utilitarian in Rorty called for assessment of consequences. Do our reforms work, or are they sowing the seeds of either greater problems in the future? And we can see how sometimes one generation's solution becomes the next generation's problem. Despite his intense concern about making things better in the future, Rorty was pessimistic about the future of humanity as a whole. This was in his writings of the 1990s. He thought we could never have enough food to nourish all adequately on a worldwide basis. He said this even before climate change threatened the livability of our planet. Like many of his contemporaries, Rorty was appalled by the Vietnam War and lamented divisions among Americans on the left between those who spelled America with a K and those who still hoped to lead the nation back to the ideals of Whitman, Lincoln, Dewey, and Herbert Crowley, The Promise of American Life, published in 1919. And it's a book that really presaged the New Deal and other things that happened later. In a series of lectures delivered in 1997, Rorty found the country better in its treatment of some of the previously excluded or marginalized African Americans, women, and gays. But he warned liberals that they would pay a political price in a society of intensifying inequality and declining economic condition of workers, especially their loss of sense of self-respect when they became redundant. That's more the British term for unemployment than ours, but redundancy speaks to the way people who lose a job lose a sense of self-respect, or can lose it. He foresaw the rise to power of someone like Donald Trump. Rorty thought a market economy a requirement for freedom so long it was counterbalanced by strong unions and a government committed to protecting the weak and the poor from the greed and arrogance of the rich and powerful. Our Kantian influence thinker is Ronald Dworkin, whose dates in 1931 to 2013, who majored in philosophy at Harvard before going on to the University School of Law. He compiled an outstanding academic record in both. After law school, he clerked for the great appellate court judge Learned Hand in New York City. Learned Hand never became a Supreme Court justice. For some reason or another, he just never quite fit it. But he regarded it as one of the really exalted figures in American judicial history. On one of the first dates with his future wife, Betsy Ross, Ronald Dworkin asked if they could stop at Judge Hand's house for just a minute to drop off a document. The judge invited them in, mixed drinks, and the three talked for hours. When Ronald and Betsy left, she asked, "If I see more of you, do I get to see more of him?" Imagine having Learned Hand as your Cyrano. That's pretty high level. Dworkin practiced corporate law for 15 years before yielding to his wife's demand that he be at home more and travel less. He became a philosopher of law and later a professor of law, and later added philosophy to his brief. His books, Taking Right Seriously and Law's Empire, presented his philosophic view as law as integrity. And given the individual history of the United States, a written constitution, interpretation by the courts, law is a rather more important notion of philosophic thinking than in most other societies, simply because philosophic issues wind up in court and eventually get to the Supreme Court. We were reminded today about the Supreme Court upholding the cross on public ground in Maryland, saying that this was not so much a religious symbol as it was somehow of remembrance of World War I, when it's very definitely religious. As Ruth Bader Ginsburg reminded us in her dissent from the bench. So we're a system where things that would in other systems would be settled in the legislature. In the United States, they often get settled in the courts, and that's one of the things that makes us different. Dworkin was convinced that, quote, legal reasoning is an exercise in constructive interpretation, that our law consists in the best justification of our legal practices as a whole, that it consists in the narrative story that makes of these practices the best they can be. So in effect, we work this out in a way of carrying on our interpretive activities. Integrity to him, in Dworkin's view, law as integrity demands that principle takes precedence over policy. Notice that turns around Richard Rorty, because Richard Rorty said, get the policy right, and we'll worry about the principles individually, as long as we get the right sorts of policies. Dworkin is arguing principle has to take precedence over policy. He did not like legal realism. This is Dworkin. Theory, and I'm quoting again, theories that ignore the structure of legal argument for supposedly larger questions of history and society are therefore perverse. They ignore questions about the internal character of legal argument, so their explanations are impoverished and defective. It was Oliver Wendell Holmes who argued most influentially that this kind of external legal theory, for this kind of external legal theory. And Dworkin's view was that the depressing history of social theoretic jurisprudence in our century shows how wrong he was. This is again Dworkin. We wait still for illumination, and while we wait, the theories grow steadily more programmatic and less substantive, more radical in theory and less critical in practice. I'd like to say a word about Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. He's always been one of my heroes, even though I disagree with many of his particular principles, because he's such an inspiring model of what old age can be. Well, you get old, you're going to look for them. I thought of that long before I became old myself. He wrote maybe 10,000 letters in his life. And those letters, which were dashed off at odd moments, are fun reading. They deal with philosophy, they deal with what's going on, with friendship. It's marvelous. He just scratched them out by hand. He never owned a typewriter, no less a computer. He didn't like all of those things that somehow minimized the interaction between the person and the communication. So even though he didn't much care for ordinary men and women, they were the crowd, he only really cared for people who provided direct services to him or who somehow touched the superlative, and very few people qualified for Holmes's view of that. Even so, he was still a model of what old age could bring. That's me speaking. Okay. All right. Dworkin expanded his argument from the philosophy of law to moral and political philosophy in his magnum opus, Justice for Hedgehogs, published in 2006. He concluded, no government is legitimate unless it subscribes to two reigning principles. First, it must show equal concern for the fate of every person over whom it claims dominion. Second, it must fully respect the responsibility and right of each person to decide for himself how to make something valuable of his life. Dignity must be the standard of how we treat others and what we impose on the conduct of our own lives. Unlike many thinkers, Dworkin did not see a conflict between liberty and equality. Freedom for the many is not possible unless sufficient resources are made available to all to enable them to live dignified lives. Equality of results is not guaranteed, but reasonable opportunity for all must be the standard society sets for itself. Liberty for all means that inequality must be resisted by countervailing power to offset potential domination by the rich and the powerful. So he and Rorty start off from quite different positions, but they wind up at more or less the same place. That in order for inequality to be reduced and liberty to be promoted, we really need a kind of activist government. In a small book published posthumously, Dworkin set out his commitment to religion without God. That's the title of it. He was an atheist who considered himself religious in his sense of awe at the beauty of nature and the possibilities of human life. I find the book eloquent but unconvincing. Nature is beautiful, but it's also terrifying with earthquakes and tornadoes and various other things. So I simply don't find it that, as the way he did. What is comforting is that Taylor, Rorty, and Dworkin represent reasonable comprehensive accounts that are amenable to a Rawlsian John Rawls, The Theory of Justice, overlapping consensus of basic political values supporting liberal democracy. So, how do we as humanists work with others who may have different comprehensive accounts to get things done in a positive way? I think one of the things that we're moving toward, and I really have a problem with this, is that somehow or other we want to be pure in our political positions, and we don't want to have much to do with people who don't follow all of our political persuasions. That seems to me to be a pretty bad place. There is a tradition in political thinking going back to Machiavelli that it is very difficult to exercise political power without having dirty hands, or without getting involved with people that you'd really rather have nothing to do about. Think of the grief that Joe Biden is now getting for the fact of saying, well, he could work with people like James Eastland and Strom Thurmond, Herman Talmadge. I mean, horror stories in most of our eyes. But he said he found something redeeming him if they could agree with him on a particular political thing. So in effect, I hope we can get to the point where we find enough common ground that we can get something done. One of the things that I look for with a little hope is maybe we can reduce mass incarceration in the United States, which has been absolutely devastating, if people will agree to that, even if they have different motives. That's, I think, one of the things that, maybe what we could hope for in politics. If politics is the art of the possible, we can't do everything. We have to make incremental steps. I think this is one of Richard Rorty's things. How do we return to what he considered the period, say, between 1914 and 1965, when liberals looked to make incremental steps? A little bit of Wilson's progressivism, something in the Rooseveltian New Deal, finally in Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. There was a period there in which people could get together. Ted Kennedy was a good example of this, forging coalitions in the Senate in order to get desirable things done. To the extent that we focus on ideological purity and consistency, we might find ourselves with a suitable comprehensive account for ourselves that other people don't agree with, and the result is we don't get done what we want. I had a good friend who served in the Ohio legislature, and he said what you were looking for was when you could get to a position where everybody could say, we can live with this. It may not be what we wanted, but we can live with it. And that would be a good point. What do we want? What are we willing to settle for? And there are some things that are very difficult, some issues that are very difficult to do that with, and those are the tough questions. But ideally, I'd like to see us get to that point where we look for, in John Rawls's terms, an overlapping consensus where people of different comprehensive accounts can get together at least sufficiently to do something. We may only make baby steps each time, but somewhere we have to keep pushing in order to get those done. So, floor is open. Now, okay, my grandson is going to relay questions for me, so my hearing is shot. He'll help.
Okay. Any questions, raise your hand and we'll come around with the microphone.
Hi. You had me curious right off when you were talking about the Kantian thing about the right is better than the good.
Takes precedence over the
yeah,
good.
and it's like, I mean, that's completely dependent on how you define right and good. And I'm trying to stretch my brain into thinking how you can define good that conflicts with the right, you know. So it's like, you know, my brain just went tilt. It's like, wait a minute, you know, how can you do the right thing without doing good? That's kind of like.
Well, Kant said that you must treat all rational beings as ends in themselves and not simply means to the achievement of your projects. That fits with what Dworkin is saying about the dignity of each human being must be acknowledged. You could set situations where you could say, you know, if we enslave 10% of the population, the other 90% is going to do pretty well. You know, we could improve our position by being absolutely miserable to the bottom 10%. And a Kantian would say, no way, because you must recognize the integrity of everyone. If you go for the greatest good of the greatest number, you can wind up doing some, you know, pretty nasty things to the least well-favored.
Yeah, well, that's not how I would define good, but I can see how if you use those definitions, yeah, you can go down those blind alleys.
Yeah.
Creating horrible society.
Yeah, well, you know, defining the right is, you know, Kant does it through said, okay, we are rational creatures, and we must impose our morality upon ourselves. He said, going back to Kant, he said, two things fill me with awe: the starry skies above me and the moral law within me. And so we can get together as moral creatures and create, not discover, but create an idea of what is right, and then impose that upon ourselves. It may, you know, sometimes it might be a distinction without a difference, but in a way, it's what are you looking for? You know, are you result-oriented or are you principle-oriented? And a Rorty is result-oriented, and a Kantian might be principle-oriented, as Dworkin was when it came time to how the law should function. You know?
Where do they stand on compassion, love, kindness towards fellow human beings, that kind of stuff?
I'm not sure what. No, I mean, what does it mean to be human? So we are not simply rational. You know, we're not simply what adds up to the sum of preferences. You know, we want to be what a full human being is, and a full human being can be somebody who loves and somebody who suffers. And we want to minimize suffering and bring more joy into people's lives.
Right.
And you know, when you think about the immiseration of so many people in our society, then you really say, what in the hell are we doing? You know, what is it now? What, 1/6 of our children are suffering from malnutrition of one sort or another? What is it, 20% of our children are in poverty?
The life
something
expectancy
really
of
wrong,
Americans has declined over the
in
last
that.
3 years.
Yeah. You know, I taught college for most of my life. But then you say, where should we be focusing our attention? In my view, it's 0 to 4. The very first stages of human life are the most important. You know, the children need that sense of security and love, and they need that exposure to language. They need that exposure to moral standards. And if they don't get that, you know, the whole business of deferred gratification, the 1 marshmallow, 2 marshmallow test, you know. The kids who can wait for the second marshmallow are going to do better in life than the kids who can't. You know, learning how to defer gratification, transferring more gratification in the future from less gratification now. But the circumstances in which so many kids grow up don't teach them that. You know, and that's a sad situation. Yeah.
Thank you for your eloquence. Thank you for your language. Would you mind terribly speaking for the next 7 hours? What question? the 1/6 of the children who grow up in poverty and do not have enough to eat. Where do we go with this? Where do your philosophers, where do you, I won't put this on you, where do your philosophers go with how do we fix it? That's good problem identification.
Well, if you're going to say that we should recognize the dignity of all human beings, we have to help children develop that sense of dignity. Well, that's I'm not put it this way. It's not my department, said Werner von Braun. I shoot the rockets into the air where they land, I don't care. No, I mean, I think we have to say, what are the kinds of policies that would move toward the improvement of the children's lives? I was astounded to read something this past few days about the temporary assistance for needy families, that many states use that money to promote anti-abortion programs than to give cash grants to hungry families. But that to me is a distortion. When John Roberts said in the Affordable Care Act that the federal government cannot coerce the states, for the expansion of Medicaid, that to me was, going contrary to the whole notion of what it was all about. He upheld the notion that we would have the penalty for not having health insurance was a tax, and so he upheld that. But he did not uphold the idea of a federal mandate to expand Medicaid when the feds were going to pay the bulk of the bill. Robert said that's not a legitimate use of federal authority. Makes a difference. I mean, these things make a very real difference. And James Heckman is an economist who talks very much about the question of 0 to 4. He does not want to see government in a lot of those kinds of programs. I'm not sure how you're going to do this without some form of governmental program, because otherwise it becomes hit and miss. It has to be some sort of overarching federal program to promote the well-being of children. And you might also have to say, well, we can do that for 2 children, but no more, because we wouldn't want to encourage people to have lots of children just to keep the cash flowing. That might be a perverse incentive. So these are not easy questions. And, working out a policy that gets the incentives right is very difficult. And I'm not saying I know how to do that. If I did, I'd be $1,000 a day consultant in Washington. But I mean, I do think that we can say as a political demand that we want Congress to do something significant about childhood nurture, childhood nutrition, childhood development that we don't do now. If I may say one more thing about this. Look at the immigration mess. That's really Congress's responsibility, and it's not doing it. It's saying not washing its hands of it. Congress has to adopt a comprehensive immigration policy. Hasn't touched the issue in 30 years, because it's dynamite, and you're going to get somebody angry. But I think that's Congress's responsibility. Yes.
So for those of us who don't have a whole lot of time to read, which one of those books would you really truly recommend that?
Okay, the question is, which of the books would you rather? Well, this is in effect saying, who's the most accessible and the most important? I would say Richard Rorty, a book he published in the 1990s, and I can't come up with a name now, and I should. This is what I mean about the impact of age.
We all do that.
It's not my department. I just say, hey, I'm past it. No, but Richard Rorty wrote a book in the 1990s, and he makes the argument that America's best is in Emerson, Whitman, Lincoln, John Dewey. You know, a lot of us had trouble with American history because of its racism, because of its misogyny, because of its treatment of Native Americans. We've got a lot to answer for. But there is also a usable past of people who did and said things that we should honor. So I guess if I had to go with one, I'd go with Rorty. I'd
Okay,
go with
thank
Richard
you.
Rorty. Yeah.
Yeah, can you spell his last name? R-O...
R-O-R-T-Y.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Okay, no, it's not that. 1997.
Okay.
You know, Alexander Hamilton said when Thomas Jefferson was elected president of the United States, he said, I am not made for this world. When I see a grandson had a handheld device to think things right away, I am not made for this world.
Truth, politics, and postmodernism?
No, that's a possibility, but it's not the only one.
Okay, I'll keep looking.
He wrote a lot. A series of lectures. I'll just say Richard Rorty. And they have, there is an anthology that students have put together, but it's a big, thick book. And Rorty is fun to read. I must say this. He's a much better stylist than John Dewey is. Yeah. Achieving our
Country. Achieving our country? Is that?
Contingency, irony, and solidarity. Achieving
there it is. Wait a minute.
Achieving our country.
Achieving our country. Yeah.
Thank you.
No, it's a series of lectures that Rorty gave, and it's good stuff. Yeah, I would say that. Yeah.
Okay, I want to say another thing. So, so this is all about what's going on in the U.S., but this is really horrific. I don't know if I should even bring it up. So, have any of you seen the TED Talk with Peter Singer, Effective Altruism? Oh my goodness. Okay. So, you know, when we were little and our mothers told us to finish all our dinner because of all the starving children in China. Well, it's true. But nobody ever put a number on it. But Peter Singer does. Peter Singer is a Harvard professor of ethics. And that TED Talk, Effective Altruism, will really shake you up. I won't say why. But I will tell you this. He does put a number on the number of children who die every day due to malnutrition and preventable diseases. Anybody want to venture a guess? It's less than it used to be. It's 19,000 a day. And that's just children. 10,000 of those are under 5. That's just the children. There's also old people and people our age. So we have a long way to go.
Anyone want to follow that?
Okay.
No question? No?
My question may be a little bit unfair, but I think it's worth looking at. Do you think Mr. Rorty would be writing the same things today if he lived in our time?
Do you think Rorty would still have the same opinion today if he lived in our time?
I think he'd be even more appalled than he was in the 1990s because inequality has increased. We've ignored the opportunities to do something about climate change. I think he would feel even worse than he did in the 1990s because we've gone in the wrong direction. And, you know, his argument, he makes an argument that liberals, and I'll use that word, proudly, that liberals have missed the boat by not paying enough attention to class. You know, when you get identity politics and people identify on the basis of a certain number of attributes, and that becomes their identity and that becomes what they're concerned about, and then they don't look at the people who are suffering because their economic opportunities are limited and their sense of self-respect is under attack, and they worry about the position of their future. You know? I remember once saying to another historian, when I became a grandparent, the future was more important to me than the past. Even though my profession was studying the past, my status as a grandparent is wondering, what is life going to be like for them? And I think that, most of us have to feel that way. I think, you get the people who are worried about what is the future of the human race given climate change. And, you mentioned what is happening in other parts of the world. Bangladesh is going to get hit a lot harder than we are. Maybe Miami and Brooklyn may have to worry about rising seas. Bangladesh will be underwater with rising seas. So there's a real difference there. How do we get people to think? How do we get people to expand the moral community? How do we get to make more of it as we and less of as they? And it's very difficult to get people to think beyond themselves and their own immediate families. That's a hard thing. We care much more about ourselves and our immediate relationships than we do about people even down the street. I don't know if you've had the experience that I've had. I used to have asthmatic attacks, and I'd wind up in the hospital in an emergency room. And I'd look around at the people in the emergency room and say, I've lived in this city for 35 years, and I don't think I've ever met any of these people. I don't know them, because I'm encased in, let's say, an upper middle class part of town, professionals, what have you. And what happens in the east and south sides of Akron, the working class communities, I'm clueless. And I think that happens to a lot of us, That's one of the things that, to expand that sense that we're all in the same boat together, that's not an easy thing to grasp. We may grasp it intellectually, but in the sense of really doing something about it, it's very difficult. I'll be absolutely, you talked about cotton. We should all be vegans. Because if we're worried about the climate change, factory meat production is devastating to the environment. And yet, how many of us are willing to give up a good steak? No, but I mean, it's rare, right? Okay, but it is. I mean, most of you would agree that there are not.
Wrong audience for that statement.
No, well, I don't know. This is obviously this is a special group in many ways, but yeah. Well.
Any other questions?
What?
Of your two atheist philosophers, one seemed to be sort of an idealist, kind of a Platonist, and the other guy was a pragmatic. Which one might be most responsible for the condition we're in? It strikes me that some of the thinking in our present politics reflects one of those two, and I wondered if you might comment on that.
I'm not sure how to summarize that.
Well, I think I guess what I would hope I could leave you with, first of all, here are three people worth reading. And as you said, reading time is limited, but these people are worth reading. Sources of the Self, Charles Taylor's book, it really gives you somebody, he's read everything, he's thought about it, and he writes well about it, and you think, okay, this is a heavyweight, this is somebody, to whom you must, it's worth paying attention. I mean, this is one of the things that I love about being retired. I have 3-4 hours a day to do some serious reading. The best part of my day is heading over to a Starbucks, 5 o'clock in the morning, nobody else around. I sit there with my book and I have an hour of unrestricted reading and reflection. That is luxury. That's luxury. And I think, when people are in that position, I think this is what we ought to take, And, coming back to where we should be, I take Rorty as, okay, get the job done, and work with whomever you can. don't ask whether or not they are humanists or not, or theists. If you agree on a common policy perspective, work on it. And that would be what we'd have to do. If we want to turn everybody into a humanist, that's not going to happen. So, we've made a decision. Our comprehensive account is secular humanism. That's fine. But we have to be able to work with people who have other comprehensive accounts if we can find areas that we would agree on and we think worth doing, and then get together on it. So,
Hello, everyone. So when I think about basically what you're talking about are existential risks, and trying to solve them from a humanist and philosophical point of view. But when I look at the state of technological progress and just human progress in general, the things that we've created for ourselves limit our attention to detail and our attention span in general. So do you think that to me, I think no matter what we do, we can try our best. But I think that as humans, we are limiting our time clock ourselves as far as our species. Do you think this is from a larger part of biological context in which we're doomed to end our species, and because we're human and we have cognitive intellect, do you think that this is just the way that the human species will go down in general, no matter what we do? I mean, I know these great people did a lot of great thinking and had a lot of great ideas, but progress will happen. And I can't see where that progress is helping us in our posterity, thinking about the future. So are we really just doomed, is my question.
I'm not quite, my hearing is so bad, I'm not quite sure I got that. But if you think about what is it that distinguishes us from other primates, it's language. And so it is language that makes us human, and it's language which enables us to converse and to dig out the implications of what being a language user means and is. We are, let's say, hardwired through evolution to be able to learn any human language. And if we're lucky, like Charles Taylor, to grow up knowing two at the same time. But the language itself enables us to expand our perspectives and our ability to interact with each other. How do we get into a situation of dialogue and of exchange in ways that can enhance our humanity? Bill Nye gave a commencement speech. Some of you may have seen that. He said, everybody you meet will know something that you don't. Everybody has some experience that you have not had. So you can learn from everybody if you're open to it. And so what do we do? I remember when our youngest was married back in 2000. I said, marriage is many things, but it is above all a conversation. And so maybe you have many decades to carry on that conversation. Okay, that's the most intimate of conversations. But it can be expanded in a way that everybody that we meet and interact with, we have the potentiality to learn something from and to enhance our humanity through the exchange of words. And it's not easy. We rely on the superficial maybe rather than what's really important, but that's part of our problem. One of the things that people have talked about, and I've wondered about this myself, are humans innately tribal, or do we get beyond tribalism? The the college graduates are now being considered a tribe of their own, because college graduates are now a distinct group politically that differs from everybody else. So some people are a tribe because of this. Others might be a tribe because of a particular kind of education. But Richard Rorty said this. He said, what we should do in high school is give people the pieties. Tell them about Valley Forge, tell them about all the good things of American history. And when they get to college, we should shake them up. So that college ought to be an exercise in critical thinking. Where high school might be an exercise in ramming down the old glory gun. But college should be something different. I'm not quite sure you should treat high school students that way myself. Having taught high school, I know you can do more with bright high school kids than you can with dumb college kids. But but I mean that sense of how do we engage in a critical evaluation? When Rorty talked about the people who spoke America with a K, they were the ones who thought that this was some sort of nightmare. And okay, we went off the rails in Vietnam. I think I would certainly think so. But we can and did, I hope, do a little bit better. But who knows? I certainly don't want to see the same result in 2020 than we saw in 2016. I know that. Yeah. Okay.
Any more?
Hey, I didn't take up enough time. You're going to be
Oh, no. That was a lot.
No.
It was awesome. Thank you so much.
That was bad. I'm sorry about that.
No, it was wonderful. We really enjoyed it, obviously. And I suppose you have several of these already.
Okay.
But we do love
Thank
to mug
you.
our speakers. And we are looking forward to your next talk.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. And if anybody can help clean up, that would be awesome.